Welcome back. Last time we created a component with the UseEffect hook to fetch data from an API and then display it with JSX. The next goal is to create a component that does very much the same. Fetch data from an API and then set the result in the state and then display it within the returned JSX. For this, I've created an API called the news proxy. So go to github.com/15dcats/news proxy. The news proxy is actually a server which conducts fetches to the Hacker News API to get the latest top stories in the tech industry. The reason that I made a proxy server is that the Hacker News API only returns a list of the internal IDs of the top stories. And then you got to make a request for each top story one at a time, according to its ID, if you want the full details of all the top stories. So that's a little too much work. So I wrapped up requests for the top 10 stories in one request that you can make to this proxy at /top stories. So if you're at the repo, go to the README and then click on the /top stories link. What you should find is an array of objects, and each one contains the title, as well as the original author in a by field, and then other fields relevant to that particular story object. There's this interesting kids array, and the kids for a story represents comments on the story in the Hacker News platform according to its unique ID. Now, the course implementation won't be using the kids in our app, but this is a coding challenge, so feel free to incorporate it if you'd like. The course implementation will be using another field though, the score, and the score represents how many upvotes the article has on the Hacker News platform. In other words, it's the article's popularity. All right, that covers the API for the new component. So go ahead and start the challenge and create the new stories component in the stories.js file. Again, it should make the request to /top stories at this news proxy server. And keep in mind that this challenge is optional. So feel free to leave this video unpaused if you want to move through the course at a quicker pace. All right, let's begin. Head back to your code editor and then create a stories.js file with a capital S. First up, we're going to import React as well as the hooks that we've used before, such as useState and UseEffect from the React module. Then we're going to set up the stories component, and let's export this by default right away from the stories.js file. Within the component, let's set up the state for the stories with the useState hook. So we're going to structure a story state variable as well as a set stories setter method. And then this is the result of calling the useState hook and then supplying an empty array as the initial value. Then we can set up an effect to fetch data. So let's call the UseEffect hook, and this takes a callback which will run after every single render of the component. We're going to make a fetch to the overall URL for /top stories. So head back to your browser and go ahead and copy the URL that you got from the repository at newsproxyserver.appspot.com/top stories, and then make that the string that is going to the fetch URL. We'll follow with a .then handler since the fetch returns a promise, and we're going to have a callback with a response parameter that returns the response.json method, which also returns a promise. So we follow with another .then handler, and then this one gets the resulting JSON, and let's call set stories and pass in that JSON, so that way the stories state variable is now going to be the result of the overall fetch, that JSON itself. Now, one thing to definitely include is the second argument to UseEffect, and let's provide an empty array. This is an array of variables that control whether or not the effect is called between renders if those variables have changed. But by supplying an empty array, we can ensure that this effect only triggers after the initial render and not in subsequent renders. Cool. So that covers fetching the data. Now for the actual JSX. Let's return a div with the class name of capital stories. The index.css file is set up to stylize a div with this class name. Let's also have a header3 element with the text content of stories. After rendering the stories, we're going to add a pair of curly braces because we're going to be generating JSX based on mapping over this stories array in the state. So let's call stories.map. And then for the callback, we're going to return JSX one story at a time. Let's destructure some relevant fields such as the ID, the by field, which represents the author, the time that the story was created, the title of the story, as well as the URL from the story object. So that way we can use those fields within the following lines. For the actual JSX, let's return a div. And since we're now generating this JSX in a map, it's important to include a key field. And that key can be the unique ID for the story. We need a key so that React can uniquely identify each sibling block of JSX. That way it knows how to efficiently render subsequent data, even if they almost have an identical composition. Within that div, let's go ahead and render the title. Now we're going to make the title clickable, so let's have an anchor element. And then this is going to the href of the URL, and the text itself is going to be the title. Let's also display the author field and the time. So we're going to have a div here. First up, the text is going to be the by field, which represents the author. And then let's make a string out of the date, or rather the time, by passing it into an instance of the date class. So make sure you have the new keyword to create an instance of the global date class. And let's call it to locale time string, because this returns a nicely formatted, or rather to locale string, because this returns a nicely formatted string value for the actual time, which is originally a number in seconds. Okay, so once you have that, that completes the stories component. With all this code done, you're going to want to head back to the app.js file and then import the stories component. So have a line that imports the stories component from the local ./stories file. And then in the returned JSX, after the joke, let's also have another horizontal ruler element. And now let's include the stories through its JSX. Nice. Now, if you don't have the application running already, fire npm run start in the project home directory. Then go ahead and visit the application at localhost 3000 and then give it a refresh. React script should have also started the project in the background, so you'll probably already have the stories appearing. And cool. So what you should find is a list of the latest top stories in tech. No doubt it's pretty useful to have this information at the ready within your homepage, so that you can stay up to date on what's going on in the industry. Now, there's something off. You'll notice that these time fields all look like they're coming from 1970. So unless these articles could predict the future, there's no way these things were published almost 50 years ago with this kind of subject matter. The reason for this 1970 business is that the API returns a time in Unix time, which counts in seconds from January 1st, 1970 for the time value. However, the JavaScript date class assumes that you're counting from milliseconds from that same date. Therefore, what we need to do is multiply that time by 1000. So back in stories.js, what should go into the date constructor is that time multiplied by 1000. Okay, with that change, go ahead and refresh the app. And then what you should find is times relevant to your current date. Cool, now the information is more accurate. Nice. So between the joke component and the stories component now, we have duplicate code for the hook's setup. There is the same pattern of a useState hook to set up the state, the UseEffect hook to fetch and then set that data, and then we're displaying that data as a result. Pretty much the only thing that's distinct is the URL that is fetched. Now, one of the main intentions of the entire hooks feature and update is that as a React developer, you should have the power to set up your own custom hooks around React functionality. So we're going to do that in the next video. We're going to create a custom hook that can set up the state, use an effect to fetch the data, and then return that data as a result. And then we're going to refactor both components to use that custom hook. So let's do that next. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to head to the full course at udemy.com/React Hooks tutorial. Since you're coming from YouTube, I'm giving you access to the course at the max discount Udemy lets me create. I've posted details in the video description, and be sure to visit my website at davidtkatz.com as well, where you can find links to connect with me. All right, see you in the next one.